This video continues from the previous video. Okay, move to the next slide here. Okay, and so I was running out of time for the other video. But just to continue with the summary, just up to this point, this has just been sort of a general introduction to the grammar and the visual language that we use in our designs. And the better we understand that grammar, the better we can speak the language, and the more effectively we can communicate with our audience as a result. Okay, this visual language is the context within which we study the design principles, elements and principles. So when we're learning to use grids or understand line weights or color, we are doing that in order to communicate more effectively with our audience. In this photo, the principles are the trees. The visual grammar is the forest. Well, I would say that's not exactly true. The elements are the trees. The way they are laid out is the principles, and the visual grammar is the forest. In fact, while y'all are here, so we don't get confused, let's say this. Their layout there we go. Now it's correct. Okay. So here we go. Welcome to the principles and elements. And these are, they're not all, but they're some of the ones we will be studying. And so the difference between the principles and the elements is that design elements are the things we use in the design, such as color, line, shape, texture. And the principles are the way we arrange them. Again, the words and sentences, but more than beyond a sentence structure. We can go up and down and back and forth and have 3D. When we add space and color, actually, I skipped something there, so that doesn't make sense on its own, does it? Different people will group them differently or give them different names. This is not, it's not like math, a field like math, where they're very particular about everything. We're much more open and loose about it. But we're going to start with the basics, okay? So elements convey messages. For instance, a dot has a different story to tell than a line. And we keep going back to that word story, and we're going to get more into storytelling. But everything, all art, all fine art, has a story behind it. And we're going to learn to talk about that. So when you're putting that dot on there, what's its story? If you're putting a line on there, how does it relate to the story? Every element serves a different function. Now, you don't necessarily have to use every element in every single design, but you need to know which ones to pick and which ones to apply and why. You also need to know that when you pick them and place them, what are you communicating? Because it all goes back to Gestalt. When you lay things out in a formal manner, it conveys a formal language. And so it matters. Okay, so elements are the actual things we add to the design, and principles are how we organize those elements on the page or screen or in the model that we're working on. The goal is we're communicating, and elements and principles are the tools through which we communicate. Okay, and so some of the guidelines that we use are based on scientific data and some on psychology, and we have studied this. Some are simply observations over time of what works and what doesn't. And that's true, right? Some of that's a little more nebulous. It's not necessarily written down. You just can look at something and know that it works or it doesn't work. And you get better at that the more you study this. Once you have mastered them, then you're free to break them. But you should always understand why they exist and what you're communicating when you break it. Okay, so for instance, If you have two objects that contrast against each other, like a black dot and a white dot, you're conveying a message that those objects are different. If both dots were black, you would be saying they're the same. That's the visual language. If you have a black dot, a white dot, and a red dot, you now have three distinct colors that communicate three distinct things. If you have 60 dots and some of them are black and one of them is red right in the middle, again, you have again conveyed information that out of all those dots, the one in the middle that's red is not only different, but because it's the only one, it's a point of focus. You have to know this in order to apply it appropriately. If strongly aligning objects in your design provides a sense of order, when your main message is one of disorder, it makes sense to ignore the principle of balance. And so that's what we will begin to do. Okay? But I'm getting ahead of ourselves there because we're breaking stuff that we haven't even learned yet. I mean, that's what ultimately everybody wants to do. Everybody wants to break the principles and elements. Everybody wants to do their own thing because that's where creativity comes to life, is when you start breaking them. So ignoring a principle just because you don't understand it or don't feel like following it is going to lead to poor design. And that's why we're talking about this. Breaking the principle should be and should look intentional rather than unintentional. And here, this photograph is an example. Robert Frank wrote, "The photographing of America is a large order." Read at all literally, the phrase would be an absurdity. The total production of such a project he added would be voluminous. And he's not wrong, right? He shot 27,000 images on his journey across the country, and which would be condensed into a classic set of only 83 black and white photographs. And some of them are very underexposed or very overexposed. In this shot, you can see that, well, you guys can't yet, or maybe you can if you've studied it, but you can see that he's broken some of the rules. And he's done that in this case through value. Right? And so a lot of his work, when he did this, for example, this is underexposed. You can't see the detail in this man's face. You can see no detail in this man's face, right? And if you think about it, these men are under, they're all men, I believe. They're all underexposed. What message does that send when you look at that photo? That these are the people who are in the shadows. These are the unknown people. And that was part of his message. That in American society, there are people who are unnoticed, therefore underexposed. And that goes on value. And value is one of the elements of design. So you'll often see the same principle with different names. So that happens too. For example, the principle of repetition and the principle of similarity are basically the same thing. They're both the idea of repeating attributes like color or shape or size, so that two or more elements, while different, also communicate something similar. The main thing is to remember that the principles are rules or guidelines to follow because they've been shown over. That doesn't make sense. Over since humans started creating the. Because they've shown over time, since humans first started drawing on the walls or caves 35,000 years ago, to generally improve the design. And also, as we talked about, they represent gestalt. And this is an example of, the first human drawing, or at least the first human drawings that we have examples of. Okay. All right. So I intentionally want this video is a little shorter than the others, but I intentionally want to stop this here so that we can begin the next video discussing the elements of design that we're going to cover. And the ones that we're going to cover in this series are these over here. So these are going to be the ones that we are going to cover. Okay, so I will see you in the next video.